Hello, and welcome to After the Sirens. I'm HJ. If you're serious about understanding history, not just the dates and names but the human experience behind them, then I'd ask you to subscribe, comment with your thoughts as we go, and share this with someone who appreciates that kind of depth. What we're about to discuss isn't recycled trivia for a pub quiz. These are hard lessons, written in the blood of ordinary civilians during the Second World War. They are the brutal realities faced by people who looked a lot like you and me when their world fell apart. Our mission here at After the Sirens is to preserve these uncomfortable truths, not to perpetuate the romantic myths of wartime resilience that often cloud our judgment. We look at what actually happened, what mistakes were made, and what it cost. These aren't just stories from a bygone era. These are patterns of human behavior and systemic failure that repeat themselves with defying shallow regularity whenever societies collapse, whether through war, disaster, or internal strife. Understanding these mistakes is more than an academic exercise. It's about recognizing the precursors to catastrophe and knowing what choices have historically separated the survivors from the victims. It's about seeing the past clearly so you can navigate the future more wisely. The people who paid for this knowledge with their lives couldn't know what was coming. We have the benefit of their experience, and ignoring it would be the greatest mistake of all. Let's begin. During the Blitz and other bombing campaigns across Europe, one of the most immediate and deadly mistakes was a simple one: staying above ground. It seems counterintuitive, but a surprising number of people actively avoided shelter. The reasons were varied and deeply human. Some feared being buried alive, trapped under tons of rubble if their building collapsed. The thought of suffocating in the dark was, for many, more terrifying than the whistle of a falling bomb. Others suffered from claustrophobia, unable to bear the crush of bodies in a public shelter or the confines of their own cellar. This psychological barrier proved to be a fatal weakness. The evidence, however, was unequivocal. Reinforced cellars and dedicated shelters like the Anderson shelter in Britain dramatically increased survival rates. These weren't just holes in the ground, they were engineered to withstand immense pressure. Cellars, when properly shored up with timber beams and sandbags, could often hold the weight of a collapsed house above, creating a pocket of survival. The key was reinforcement. An ordinary cellar might crumble, but one that had been prepared became a fortress. People who overcame their initial fear and spent the nights in these fortified spaces were overwhelmingly more likely to see the morning. Contrast this with the fate of those who remained in their beds on the upper floors or gathered in ground floor rooms. They were completely exposed. A direct hit was, of course, unsurvivable, but the real killer was often the blast wave and shrapnel from near misses. A bomb detonating a street away could send a storm of glass, brick, and metal tearing through unreinforced walls. Staying in a living room or bedroom offered virtually no protection against this. The air raid sirens were not a suggestion, they were a command to get below ground, and those who hesitated often paid the ultimate price. The lesson from the rubble is stark. Personal fears and anxieties, however valid they may feel, must be weighed against statistical reality. In countless diaries and post-war testimonies, survivors recount the moment they decided to stop sleeping upstairs and move into the cellar. It was a decision that broke with normalcy, an admission that their world had fundamentally changed. But it was the single most effective action a civilian could take to survive aerial bombardment. The choice was between a potential, feared death and a probable, violent one. In a world of rationing and scarcity, having access to extra food seemed like the ultimate advantage, but it harbored a hidden danger that many failed to appreciate until it was too late. The mistake was not in hoarding food, which was a rational response to uncertainty, but in failing to conceal that you had it. Visible signs of relative prosperity in a sea of deprivation turned families into targets. The smell of meat cooking when neighbors had only cabbage, the sight of children looking consistently well-fed, or even the subtle clue of putting out more food waste than others, all of these were signals that could attract desperate eyes. This wasn't just about opportunistic theft from starving strangers, though that was certainly a risk. The greater danger often came from neighbors and acquaintances. In the pressure cooker environment of a blockaded city or occupied territory, community bonds frayed. Envy and desperation could curdle into resentment and denunciation. An anonymous tip to the authorities, accusing a family of black market dealing or hoarding, could lead to a raid, confiscation of all supplies, and severe punishment, including imprisonment or worse. The crime was often simply being better prepared than those around you. Effective survival meant practicing what intelligence agencies call tradecraft. It involved meticulous operational security applied to daily life. Caches of food had to be ingeniously hidden, not just in a locked pantry but in multiple dispersed locations, under floorboards, in false walls, or buried in the garden. Consumption had to be managed to avoid suspicion. This meant deliberately eating less than you had, ensuring your family appeared to be struggling just as much as everyone else. It was a grim performance, a daily act of deception necessary for self-preservation. The psychological toll of this was immense. You had to live a lie, not just to the outside world, but often within your own community. The people you once shared a coffee with could become a threat. This illustrates a brutal aspect of societal collapse. Your visible well-being can be inversely proportional to your security. The families who survived with their supplies intact were not the ones who flaunted their foresight, but those who mastered the art of appearing just as unfortunate as everyone else, all while maintaining the hidden resources that kept them alive. When the order to evacuate came, the instinct for most was to obey. Official announcements broadcast over the radio or plastered on public walls promised safety, designated routes, and organized transport away from the front lines. To many, it seemed like the only logical choice, a lifeline thrown by a government that was supposed to protect them. The catastrophic mistake, repeated from the roads of France in 1940 to the Eastern Front, was trusting these official routes blindly without any independent verification. Bureaucracies, even in peacetime, are prone to error. In the chaos of war, they could be fatally incompetent. The reality on the ground was often a world away from the promises made by officials, far from the danger. Evacuation routes frequently led directly into chaos. Roads became clogged with a desperate tide of humanity, a mix of civilians on foot, in carts, and in sputtering vehicles, intermingled with retreating military units. These columns of refugees were incredibly vulnerable. They were slow-moving, exposed, and made for perfect targets for enemy aircraft. A single strafing run could turn a packed road into a slaughterhouse. Stukas, with their terrifying sirens, became infamous for preying on these helpless columns. Furthermore, the safe destinations were often anything but. An evacuation order might direct people towards a town that was, unbeknownst to the planners, already on the verge of being overrun. Intelligence was flawed, communication lines were cut, and the situation on the battlefield could change in a matter of hours. Families who dutifully followed their instructions sometimes walked 4 days, exhausted and depleted of resources, only to find themselves walking directly into the enemy's arms or into a new combat zone. They had fled one danger, only to be delivered into another. The critical lesson, learned by survivors, was the necessity of skepticism and independent intelligence gathering. Before setting out, those who fared best tried to verify the conditions ahead. They listened to illicit radio broadcasts, pooled information with neighbors, and debriefed soldiers who were retreating from the front. They looked for alternate, less obvious routes, even if it meant a harder journey over rougher terrain. They understood that in a collapse, official channels are often the last to know the real situation. Blind trust in authority was a luxury no one could afford, and the simple act of questioning the plan before joining the exodus was a life-saving decision. In the nightly battle for survival during the Blitz, the entire civilian population was conscripted into a war of shadows. The blackout was one of the most widespread and strictly enforced civil defense measures, and for good reason. The mistake of using open flames, or allowing even the smallest sliver of light to escape a home, was not a minor infraction. It was an act that could doom an entire neighborhood. To the crew of a bomber flying tens of thousands of feet overhead in the dead of night, a single illuminated window was a beacon, a clear and unambiguous reference point in an otherwise featureless black landscape. Bomber crews were not using pinpoint GPS, they navigated by landmarks, rivers, and, if they were lucky, the light of the moon. In a city under total blackout, any light source was an anomaly that drew immediate attention. It could help them confirm their position, identify a target area, or even become the target itself. A careless homeowner who failed to properly fit their blackout curtains, or a warden who used a naked flame on the street, might not be the direct recipient of a bomb, but they could be responsible for guiding the payload onto their neighbors a few streets away. It was a terrifying form of unintentional collective responsibility, Strict light discipline became a matter of life and death, enforced with fanatical zeal by air raid precaution wardens. These volunteers patrolled the streets shouting, "Put that light out!" at the slightest glimmer. Homes were fitted with thick black material over every window. Car headlights were masked to emit only a tiny downward-facing slit of light. Even striking a match outdoors was forbidden. People learned to navigate their own homes by touch, to perform daily tasks in near-total darkness, and to live by a new nocturnal rhythm. The psychological strain of living in perpetual gloom was significant, but it was a necessary sacrifice. This demonstrates a fundamental principle of survival in a conflict zone, making yourself and your community an unattractive, difficult target. The goal of the blackout was to deny the enemy information. By turning a city into an ocean of black, it forced bomber crews to rely on less accurate methods, scattering their payloads and reducing their effectiveness. A single point of light compromised that collective defense. The lesson was brutal and simple. Your personal convenience or carelessness could provide the enemy with the one piece of information they needed to kill you and everyone around you. The collective imagination of wartime civilian suffering is, dominated by the image of the bomb, the explosion, the fire, the collapsing building. While aerial bombardment was a terrifying and immediate threat, it actually was not the biggest killer of civilians in many besieged cities and refugee crises. The far more prolific, yet silent, predator was disease. The mistake was to focus entirely on the visible threat from the sky while underestimating the invisible enemy breeding in the rubble, the contaminated water, and the crowded shelters. In places like the Warsaw Ghetto or during the siege of Leningrad, typhus, dysentery, and cholera killed vastly more people than German bombs or shells. The collapse of civic infrastructure is, in effect, the petri dish for epidemics. When bombs rupture water mains and sewer lines, clean water becomes a scarce luxury and human waste contaminates the environment. When sanitation workers can no longer collect rubbish, piles of rotting garbage become breeding grounds for rats and flies, which act as vectors for disease. People huddled together in cramped, unventilated shelters, with limited access to washing facilities, create the perfect conditions for the rapid transmission of lice, which carry typhus and airborne illnesses like tuberculosis. Surviving in this environment required a radical and immediate shift in priorities. It meant understanding that a simple bar of soap could be more valuable than a loaf of bread, and that boiling water was as crucial a defense as a reinforced cellar. People who grasped this reality took extreme measures. They would risk exposure to collect rainwater or snow to melt for a cleaner source. They meticulously disposed of waste far from their living quarters. They enforced strict hygiene rules within their family or group, understanding that the sickness of one could quickly become the death sentence of all. This lesson highlights the fragility of the public health systems we take for granted. Without reliable sanitation, clean water, and waste removal, a modern city can revert to medieval conditions with astonishing speed. The survivors were not just the lucky ones who avoided the bombs, they were the proactive ones who waged a second, personal war against filth. They became their own public health officials, fighting a desperate, microscopic battle for their lives every single day. They knew that the sirens warned of one enemy, but another, far more relentless one, was already inside the gates. In the face of societal breakdown, a common instinct is to retreat, to trust no one, and to adopt a lone wolf mentality. The belief is that by isolating yourself and your immediate family, you reduce your exposure to risk and protect your resources from others. During World War II, this proved to be a profound and often fatal miscalculation. While indiscriminate trust was certainly dangerous, complete social isolation dramatically reduced an individual's or a family's chances of survival. The complex, interlocking challenges of a collapsed society were simply too much for any one person to handle alone. Think of the sheer number of tasks required for daily survival. You needed to secure water, find food, stand guard, tend to the sick, repair your shelter, and gather intelligence. A single person, or even a couple trying to do all of this, would be stretched to the breaking point, physically and mentally exhausted, and unable to perform any task effectively. While one person was out scavenging, who was protecting the shelter? While one was caring for a sick child, who was reinforcing the windows? Isolation created critical vulnerabilities that could be exploited by circumstance or by other people. The more successful survival model that emerged was the trusted micro-network. This wasn't about forming a large, unwieldy commune, but a small, tight-knit group of individuals or families bound by deep, pre-existing trust. Perhaps it was 2 or 3 neighboring families, a group of close work colleagues, or an extended family clan. By pooling their skills, resources, and manpower, they could create a more resilient and effective unit. One person with medical knowledge, another with mechanical skills, another who was a resourceful forager. Together, they were far more than the sum of their parts. These micro-networks could operate on a shift system, ensuring someone was always on watch. They could pool their rations to cook larger, more efficient meals. They could share the burden of childcare and care for the sick. Crucially, they provided psychological support, staving off the despair and paranoia that could cripple a person's will to live. The lesson is that humans are fundamentally social creatures, and our greatest strength, especially in a crisis, lies in collaboration. The lone wolf is a romantic myth. In the brutal reality of a siege, the well-coordinated pack was the one that survived. Perhaps the single most pervasive and deadly mistake civilians made at the onset of the war was a failure of imagination, rooted in a deep-seated human desire for normalcy. It was the assumption that the crisis would be short-lived. The boys will be home by Christmas was the optimistic refrain in 1914, and a similar sentiment, though perhaps more subdued, echoed in 1939. People believed that governments would negotiate, that the initial shock would subside, and that life would soon return to normal. This normalcy bias led them to delay crucial preparations, a delay that cost countless lives. This mindset manifested in many ways. Families hesitated to spend their savings on extra food, thinking it an overreaction. They put off reinforcing their cellars or preparing a bug-out bag, believing it would never truly be necessary. They chose not to evacuate when they had the chance, unwilling to abandon their homes and jobs for what they believed would be a temporary disruption. They saw the early signs of collapse, the rationing, the restrictions, the distant sound of guns, as an aberration, not the new reality. They were waiting for the war to end before it had even truly begun. By the time the reality of a long, total war became undeniable, when the bombs were falling nightly and food had all but vanished from the shops, it was too late. The window for proactive preparation had closed. The supplies that were once available were now gone, or astronomically expensive. The routes out of the city that were once open were now cut off. The opportunity to build a network or fortify a shelter had been lost in the chaos. Those who had assumed the crisis would be brief were now forced into a reactive, desperate struggle for survival with few, if any, resources at their disposal. The stark lesson from this is that in any escalating crisis, the time to prepare is at the very beginning, when it feels like an overreaction. The survivors were often the ones dismissed by their neighbors as pessimists or alarmists. They were the ones who saw the storm clouds gathering and, instead of hoping for the best, began building an ark. They understood that you don't wait until you're thirsty to dig a well. Early, decisive, proactive preparation, based on a sober assessment of the worst-case scenario rather than a hopeful wish for a quick resolution, is the bedrock of resilience. Assuming a crisis will end soon is a gamble you can only lose once. These 7 mistakes are not relics of a distant past. They are echoes, warnings from history about the perennial frailties of human nature and civic life when placed under unbearable stress. The stories of those who perished and those who endured serve as our most valuable, if harrowing, textbook. If you believe this knowledge is important, please subscribe to After the Sirens, share this video with someone who studies history seriously, and let me know in the comments which of these lessons you feel deserves a deeper, standalone analysis in a future episode. Our purpose here is not to fearmonger, but to arm you with understanding. We are dedicated to preserving the knowledge that people learned too late, in the hope that if the sirens ever sound again, in whatever form they may take, more of us will be prepared to make the right choices. History does not repeat itself exactly, but it rhymes, and the cadence of collapse has a grimly familiar rhythm. By studying it, we can learn to recognize the tune before the final verse begins. Thank you for joining me. The past is never truly past, and the lessons are always there for those willing to listen. Stay safe, and stay informed.